Stories of slavery. Today's story is about an enslaved mother whose children were sold to cover a $100,000 debt. What she did next was something no one thought possible. This story is full of pain, loss, and desperation, and it's about a choice that seemed impossible. Take a moment, breathe deeply, and listen carefully. Before we start, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment with the city and country you're watching from. Your involvement helps ensure these stories are remembered, not forgotten. Let's begin. In October 1855, in Adams County, Mississippi, a white plantation owner named Thomas Whitmore made a decision that would destroy everything he had built. He sold 3 children to pay off a gambling debt of $1,000. But these were not just any children, they were his own sons and daughter, children he had fathered through the abuse of an enslaved woman named Celeste. He sold them as if they were animals, never imagining that the woman he had mistreated for over a decade would be the one to completely ruin him. This is a story about what happens when a man underestimates the strength and intelligence of a woman he believes he owns. It is a story of patience, cleverness, and a mother's love so strong it overcame every barrier. It is also a story of justice, though not the kind delivered in courts or through law. This is the story of Celeste and how she brought a powerful man to his knees without ever picking up a weapon. To understand what happened in Adams County, we first need to picture Mississippi in the 1850s. Cotton ruled the South and Mississippi was at its center. The land, especially along the Mississippi River, was rich and dark, shaped by centuries of flooding. Plantation owners controlled huge estates, some thousands of acres, worked by enslaved people who had no freedom, no rights, and no protection from the violence of their masters. Adams County was one of the oldest and richest counties in the state. The town of Natchez, the county seat, had more millionaires per person than almost anywhere else in America. These men had built their fortunes on the backs of enslaved laborers. They lived in grand mansions, while the people who made their wealth possible lived in small wooden cabins with dirt floors. The social structure was rigid. White plantation owners were at the top, followed by white overseers and merchants. Next were poor white people who owned no slaves, and at the very bottom were the enslaved, treated as property rather than human beings. Thomas Whitmore was not one of the wealthiest planters, but he desperately wanted to be. His family had come to Mississippi in the 1820s and bought a modest property of about 400 acres called Whitmore Hall. It was not a grand estate, but it was respectable. Thomas inherited the property in 1841 when his father died of yellow fever. From the start, he was obsessed with growing his land and wealth, wanting to join the elite whose approval he craved. The problem was that Thomas had expensive tastes and almost no business sense. He gambled on horses and cards, invested in failing ventures, and bought things he couldn't afford just to impress people who didn't respect him anyway. By the early 1850s, Whitmore Hall was deeply in debt. Thomas hid this from everyone, even his wife, Margaret. Margaret Whitmore came from a family with social standing, but no real money. She brought respectability but not fortune. She was cold, strict, and obsessed with appearances. The couple had 2 sons, sent to boarding school in Virginia at a young age. Margaret ran the household with strict control, spending most of her time socializing with other plantation wives, pretending everything at Whitmore Hall was perfect. At the time our story begins, Whitmore Hall had about 47 enslaved people. They worked in the cotton fields, took care of animals, maintained the house, and did every task needed to keep the plantation running. Among them was Celeste. Celeste was born around 1822 on a plantation in Virginia. She never knew her father. Her mother, Ruth, worked as a house slave and raised Celeste to be quiet, obedient, and invisible, skills needed to survive in a world where attention could mean punishment or being sold. When Celeste was 12, her mother was sold south to pay off her master's debts, and Celeste never saw her again. She was sold separately to a family moving to Mississippi, and after changing hands twice more, she arrived at Whitmore Hall in 1837 at about 15 years old. Thomas Whitmore noticed her immediately. Celeste was what slave traders called a fancy girl, a term used in the antebellum South for enslaved girls considered attractive and often bought for sexual exploitation. Celeste had light brown skin and features Thomas found appealing. Within months of her arrival, he began visiting her cabin at night. There was no courtship or romance, only power and violence. Thomas Whitmore assaulted Celeste for the first time at 15 and continued for 18 years. Unfortunately, this was common in the antebellum South. Many enslaved people had mixed European ancestry because of systemic sexual violence by white men, and the law treated enslaved women as property. No one recognized rape of an enslaved woman as a crime. Celeste's first child, Samuel, was born in 1843. He had lighter skin than Celeste and resembled Thomas Whitmore. Everyone knew he was Thomas's son. The other enslaved people, the overseers, even Margaret, though she never spoke of it. 3 years later, Celeste gave birth to a daughter, Eliza, and in 1850 another son, Isaiah. All 3 children were born into slavery and raised by Celeste in a small cabin behind the main house, while their father lived comfortably nearby, pretending they didn't exist. Celeste protected her children as best she could. She sang to them, told them stories of a freer world, taught them to stay out of sight, and constantly watched for any sign Thomas might notice Eliza as he had her. Many enslaved mothers lived with this fear, the fear that their daughters could be victimized as they had been, and there would be nothing to stop it. By 1855, Samuel was 12, strong and working in the fields. Eliza was 9, quiet and careful, helping in the house. Isaiah was 5, still playful and innocent. Celeste loved them fiercely. They were the only good things in her life. She would have died for them without hesitation, never imagining she would see them sold like animals to strangers while their father counted the money. Trouble began in the summer of 1855. Thomas had a $100 gambling debt he could not pay, owed to Crawford, a cotton broker from Natchez. Crawford was impatient and warned Thomas that if he did not pay, he would expose Whitmore's debts. In Adams County, reputation was almost as important as life itself. Thomas was desperate. He had borrowed everything, sold parcels of land, and had nothing left. His crops that year were poor and would not cover his expenses. He needed thousands fast. The solution was brutally simple. He would sell some of his slaves. Slave sales were common in the antebellum South, as normal as selling livestock. Every southern city had slave markets, and Natchez had one of the largest, called Forks of the Road, where hundreds of enslaved people were sold openly. The prices changed from place to place and depended on age, health, skills, and other details. A healthy adult male who could work in the fields might sell for anywhere between $800 and $1,500. Women usually sold for a bit less, unless they were trained for housework or were young and considered attractive, in which case buyers were willing to pay more for clear and terrible reasons. Children were normally priced lower than adults, but a healthy child who could grow into a strong worker was still seen as valuable property. Thomas Whitmore knew very well which enslaved people he planned to sell. Samuel was strong and healthy and already able to do serious work in the fields, so he would bring a solid price. Eliza was young, pretty, and trained for domestic duties, exactly the kind of girl that certain buyers wanted. Isaiah was still very young, but children were often sold in groups or to buyers who were thinking long-term. Together, the 3 children could bring in enough money to cover Whitmore's debt to Crawford. The fact that these children were his own blood did not seem to slow him down at all. Maybe he had never truly seen them as his children. Maybe years of denying them had convinced him they meant nothing. Or maybe fear drove him so deeply that he was willing to do anything to protect his position. Whatever the reason, Thomas Whitmore made his choice, and on a cool morning in October of 1855, he put that choice into action. Celeste had no idea what was about to happen. She woke before sunrise, as she always did, and started her work in the kitchen. She had been assigned to house duties years earlier, which meant cooking, cleaning, and serving in the main house, while her children worked in other parts of the plantation. The work was exhausting, but it kept her close enough to sometimes see her children and reassure herself that they were safe. The first sign of trouble came late in the morning. Celeste was in the kitchen when she heard horses approaching more than usual. She looked out the window and saw 3 unfamiliar men riding up the drive alongside Thomas Whitmore. They were neatly dressed and clearly wealthy, with the serious look of men who had come for business. A cold feeling settled deep in Celeste's stomach. She had seen slave traders before. She recognized the way they stared at people, measuring them, turning human lives into numbers and money. These men had the same look. She tried to convince herself she was mistaken. She told herself Whitmore was selling field hands, or perhaps older workers who could no longer produce as much. But the feeling would not leave her. When she saw one of the men pointing toward the area where the children usually gathered, her heart seemed to stop. Celeste moved without thinking. She ran from the kitchen toward the quarters, ignoring the shouts behind her and caring only about reaching her children. She found Samuel first and grabbed his arm, demanding to know where Eliza and Isaiah were. Before he could answer, she heard Eliza scream. What followed became a nightmare that stayed with Celeste for the rest of her life. White men, complete strangers, were seizing her children and dragging them toward the horses and wagon. Samuel fought back, and one man struck him across the face so hard that blood poured from his nose. Eliza cried and called for her mother as she struggled against hands that held her thin arms like metal clamps. Isaiah, only 5 years old, stood frozen in fear, tears running down his face. Too scared to even scream, Celeste threw herself at the men. She scratched, clawed, and bit, using every bit of strength she had. It changed nothing. Someone hit her from behind, and she fell hard, her face slamming into the dirt. When she finally pushed herself up, her children were already being forced into a wagon. Samuel was still fighting, and his hands had been tied. Eliza had gone still, her eyes blank with shock. Isaiah reached for her, crying for his mother, calling her name again and again. Standing next to the wagon, watching everything with an empty expression, was Thomas Whitmore. Celeste looked at him, the man who had abused her for nearly 20 years, the man who had fathered her children and was now selling them like animals. Something inside her changed. The fear and panic that had filled her moments earlier turned into something colder and sharper. She did not scream. She did not beg. She simply stared at Thomas Whitmore. In that moment, she made a silent promise to herself. She did not know how or when, but she would destroy him. She would take everything from him. She would make him suffer in ways he could not imagine. And when he had lost it all, she would find her children and bring them home. The wagon rolled away, carrying her children down the dusty road toward Natchez, where they would be split apart and sold to different buyers. Samuel was sold to a cotton planter from Alabama named Jeremiah Stone. Eliza was bought by a wealthy family in New Orleans for housework. Isaiah, too young to be immediately useful, was sold cheaply to a sugar plantation in Louisiana, where even very young children were put to work as soon as they were able. In a single morning, Thomas Whitmore had scattered his own children across 3 different states. He paid off his debt to Crawford and returned to his life as if nothing had happened. That night, he ate dinner in his fine dining room, served by enslaved people who moved quietly around him. He slept comfortably beside his wife, Margaret, who did not ask where the money had come from. The next morning, he rose and went about his business, never once thinking about the children he had sold or the woman whose life he had shattered. But Celeste was already planning. In the days after the sale, she moved through her work like a shadow. She cooked, cleaned, and served exactly as she always had. She answered when spoken to and followed every order. To anyone watching, she looked like a woman who had accepted her loss and surrendered to her fate. That was exactly what she wanted them to believe. Inside her mind, plans were forming. She turned over ideas, searching for weak points, looking for anything she could use. She had no money, no power, and no legal rights. She was property, watched constantly by white people who could punish her for the smallest mistake. Any plan she made had to be carried out with extreme patience and complete secrecy. One wrong move, one hint of suspicion, and she could be sold away herself or beaten so badly that she could no longer think clearly at all. The first thing Celeste needed was information. She had to learn Thomas Whitmore's weaknesses, his secrets, the things he kept hidden. She needed something she could use against him, some kind of leverage that could allow an enslaved woman to bring down a white plantation owner in a system designed to prevent exactly that. Working in the main house gave her chances that field workers never had. She moved through rooms all day cleaning, cooking, and serving. She overheard conversations not meant for her. She saw letters left on desks, papers spread out, visitors coming and going. Most house workers learned to protect themselves by pretending not to see or hear anything. Celeste did the opposite. She began to notice everything. At first, she did not even know what she was searching for. She collected bits of information, memorizing names, numbers, and short pieces of conversation without fully understanding them. Thomas Whitmore complained about money problems to visitors. Margaret Whitmore wrote letters to her sister about her husband's gambling. The overseer talked about crop results and labor output. Business partners discussed cotton prices and shipping plans. Celeste took it all in, storing it away in her memory, waiting for it to become useful. There was one major problem. Celeste could not read. Like most enslaved people in the South, she had never been taught. In many southern states, teaching enslaved people to read and write was illegal. Slaveholders knew that literacy meant power. A person who could read could gain information, create passes, and communicate in secret. Keeping people illiterate was a way to keep control. Celeste understood that if she was going to succeed, she would have to learn, and she knew exactly who could help her. His name was Solomon. He was an old man, nearly 70, who had worked at Whitmore Hall since before Thomas was born. When he was young, he had been a house servant on a plantation in Virginia, where the owner had unusually allowed some enslaved people to learn basic reading and math. Solomon learned to read as a child and had hidden that skill for more than 50 years. He was careful and never read openly or revealed his ability to anyone he did not trust. Celeste had known Solomon her entire time at Whitmore Hall, and she knew his secret. Once, late at night, she had seen him reading a torn piece of newspaper. He looked up and saw her watching. For a long moment, they stared at each other. Then she turned and walked away, and neither of them ever spoke of it again. Now she went to Solomon and asked him to teach her. It was a huge risk for both of them. If they were discovered, the punishment would be harsh. Solomon could be sold away, whipped, or even killed. Celeste could suffer the same cruel fate. Yet when Solomon looked at her, he noticed something in her eyes that made him agree. Perhaps he saw the anger and strong will burning beneath her quiet manner. Perhaps he simply knew that some dangers were worth facing. Whatever the reason, he agreed to help her. They started meeting secretly late at night in a quiet corner of the barn where no one usually came. Solomon began by teaching Celeste the alphabet, then short words, then longer sentences, and slowly moved on to harder reading. Celeste learned quickly. Her desire to learn pushed her forward, and she took in knowledge the way dry ground soaks up rain. Within a few months, she could read simple papers. Within a year, she could read almost anything, even though it was slow and tiring for her. Now doors were opening that had always been closed to her. She could read letters that Margaret Whitmore received and carelessly left behind. She could read business papers in Thomas Whitmore's study while she cleaned. She could read receipts and records that showed every money deal on the plantation. Little by little, a clear picture appeared. Thomas Whitmore was not just having money problems. He was close to total ruin. He owed money to nearly everyone, including banks, shop owners, and other planners. He had even borrowed money using the plantation itself as security, which meant that if he failed to pay, he could lose everything he owned. His cotton harvests had been getting worse for years. Part of this was because he refused to spend money on caring for the land properly. Another part was because he worked the enslaved people so hard that many were sick, exhausted, and unable to produce as much as before. His wife Margaret had a small inheritance that was kept separate from his debts, but even that could not save him. Thomas Whitmore was sinking, and he was dragging everyone around him down as well. This knowledge was helpful, but it was not enough. Money troubles alone would not destroy Whitmore. Many planners were deep in debt, and some of the richest men in the South had built their wealth by borrowing heavily. Creditors might pressure him or force him to sell property, but that would not bring the complete destruction Celeste wanted. She needed something stronger. She needed something that would turn his own society against him, something that could not be forgiven. She found it in the spring of 1857, nearly 2 years after her children had been sold away. While cleaning Thomas Whitmore's study, Celeste came across a letter that had been left in an unlocked drawer. It was addressed to a man named Harrison. Someone Celeste knew was one of Whitmore's oldest friends from their school days. The letter was several years old, written around the time Isaiah was born, and it was clearly written in Whitmore's own handwriting. As Celeste read it, her hands began to tremble. The letter was written in a casual, joking tone, the kind men often use when writing to close friends, believing no one else will ever see it. Whitmore complained about his wife, calling her cold and distant, and bragged about his involvement with Celeste. But it was not written in a way that left room for doubt or misunderstanding. He openly spoke about Samuel, Eliza, and the baby who had just been born, and he described them in a way that made it obvious they were his children. He made crude jokes about his hidden family living in the slave quarters. He wrote with pride that his true bloodline might continue through children who would never carry his name. He even mentioned physical features that clearly proved the children were his, details no one could know without close observation. It was a confession written by his own hand and signed with his name. Celeste stood in the study, barely breathing, reading the letter again and again. Her heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst from her chest. She knew she had found exactly what she needed. This letter, if shown to the right people, could ruin Thomas Whitmore far more completely than any deed ever could. This was the truth white Southern society refused to speak about, but could not ignore when faced with proof. White masters often fathered children with enslaved women, but they did not admit it. They did not write about it. They certainly did not joke about it in letters that could be discovered. The entire system depended on pretending these things were not happening. Light-skinned children in the slave quarters were ignored as if they had appeared by accident. When a man was publicly revealed as the father of enslaved children, and when the proof was undeniable, the damage could be severe. Other planners would avoid him. Business partners would end their relationships. The polite lies that held the system together would be exposed, and those who depended on those lies would blame the man who forced the truth into the open. The money consequences were even worse. Thomas Whitmore had not only fathered enslaved children, he had sold them. The buyers believed they were purchasing children listed as fully black, not the mixed-race children of a white planter. In the cruel and twisted rules of the slave market, this was considered fraud. Buyers had paid for one thing and received another. They could demand their money back. They could take legal action. They could accuse Whitmore of knowingly lying about what he sold. This had nothing to do with right or wrong. Morality meant nothing in that world. It was about money and reputation, the only things men like Thomas Whitmore truly cared about. And now Celeste held the weapon that could destroy both. Still, she could not act immediately. She needed time. She needed more proof, and she needed a way to expose Whitmore without being killed herself. So she placed the letter back in the drawer exactly as she had found it, and returned to her duties. She showed no sign that anything had changed. She cooked dinner that night as usual. She washed the dishes. She went back to her cabin, lay in the darkness, stared at the ceiling, and began to plan. Over the following months, Celeste collected more evidence. She found Margaret Whitmore's diary, filled with painful entries about her fears and suspicions regarding her husband and that woman. Margaret had never openly confronted Thomas, but she had written everything down. She described the children in the slave quarters who looked so much like him. She wrote about seeing Thomas leave Celeste's cabin late at night. She poured out her shame, anger, and heartbreak onto the pages, creating written proof that supported the letter to Harrison. Celeste also saved small physical items. She kept locks of hair from Samuel and Eliza from when they were babies. She kept a small wooden toy Thomas had carved for Samuel when the boy was young, before Whitmore had fully hardened his heart against his own children. On their own, these items meant little, but together with the letters and diary, they formed a story that would be hard to deny. The last part of her plan involved the people who had bought her children. Celeste needed to know who they were and where they had taken Samuel, Eliza, and Isaiah. This was difficult. Slave sales were poorly recorded, and sellers were not required to tell parents anything. Still, Celeste listened closely whenever business was discussed in the house. Over time, she learned enough to put the pieces together. A planter from Alabama named Stone had bought Samuel. A family from New Orleans named Beaumont had purchased Eliza. Isaiah had been sold to a sugar plantation in Louisiana, though Celeste could not learn exactly where. Now she had proof, and she knew who held her children. The final question was how to use what she had gathered. Celeste could not send the letter or diary pages herself. She could not write in a way that allowed her to communicate with white people. And even if she could, no one would believe an enslaved woman. Her words would be ignored or dismissed as lies. She needed someone else, someone whose voice carried weight. She found that person in the fall of 1857. His name was James Crawford, a cotton broker who had been owed $1,000 by Thomas Whitmore 2 years earlier. Crawford was not a kind man. He made his living from cotton grown by enslaved labor and felt no shame about it. But he was a businessman, and he despised dishonesty and unpaid debts. He still held resentment toward Whitmore for delaying payment, and he was always eager for information that could give him power over others. Celeste took a dangerous chance. When Crawford visited the plantation, she waited until she found him alone. She told him she had information about Thomas Whitmore that would be valuable to the right people. Crawford was cautious and doubtful at first. Celeste revealed only a little, just enough to spark his curiosity. She hinted at scandal and fraud without giving full details. She told him Whitmore had sold children under false claims, and that the buyers would want to know the truth. Crawford was interested. He did not fully trust her, but he sensed there might be truth in her words. He agreed to look into the matter further, unaware that Celeste's careful plan was finally beginning to move forward. Told him that if the details she provided were true, he could use them to ensure the right people were informed. Over the following weeks, Crawford carried out his own inquiries. He reached out to the buyers who had acquired Samuel, Eliza, and Isaiah, casually asking about their experiences and whether they were satisfied with their purchases. He reviewed sales records, paying attention to the descriptions of the children that had been given. Once he had gathered enough information to believe Celeste's account, he returned to her and requested the proof. Celeste handed over copies of the letter and diary pages she had painstakingly recreated by hand during long nights in the barn. Using the writing skills Solomon had taught her, she also gave him the locks of hair and the small carved toy, recounting everything she knew about Thomas Whitmore's dealings with her and the children he had fathered and sold. Crawford accepted the evidence and vanished from Whitmore Hall. For weeks, Celeste heard nothing. She continued her work silently, showing no change in her routine, hoping her plan would succeed. She did not know whether Crawford would act on the information. She did not know if the proof would be sufficient. She did not even know if she would live long enough to witness the results of her efforts. Then, in early 1858, Thomas Whitmore's world began to unravel. The first sign came in the form of a letter. It arrived at Whitmore Hall on a bitter January morning, addressed to Thomas Whitmore and marked urgent. Celeste was serving breakfast when he opened it, and she carefully watched his expression while pretending to arrange dishes. She saw the color drain from his face. She saw his hands shake. She saw him read the letter twice, then a third time, as if he could hardly believe what was written. The letter was from Jeremiah Stone, the Alabama planter who had purchased Samuel nearly 3 years earlier. Stone was not a man to mince words. He wrote that he had recently learned shocking information about the boy he had bought from Whitmore. Samuel was not, as Whitmore had claimed, the child of 2 enslaved parents, but rather the illegitimate son of Whitmore himself. Stone demanded an explanation, a full refund of the $400 he had paid, and compensation for the costs of housing and feeding what he called damaged goods. Thomas Whitmore set the letter down and stared into emptiness. His wife Margaret asked what was wrong, and he brushed it off as a trivial business matter. But Celeste could see the fear in his eyes, the dawning realization that something terrible was occurring beyond his control. In the following weeks, more letters arrived. The Beaumont family in New Orleans, who had purchased Eliza, wrote with similar accusations and demands. They were even more furious than Stone. They had acquired Eliza to serve their household, attending to their daughters and assisting with domestic work. Now they learned she was the half-sister of their children's playmates, the daughter of a white man who had sold his own offspring. The social implications horrified them. What if someone discovered the truth? What if their friends learned they had an enslaved girl in the house who shared blood with the white planter class? They demanded their money back and insisted Whitmore take the girl back before scandal spread. The sugar plantation in Louisiana that had bought Isaiah did not send letters. Instead, they sent a hard-faced representative to Adams County demanding a private meeting with Thomas. Celeste did not hear what was said, but she saw the aftermath. Whitmore looked as if he had been told he was dying. The news spread through Adams County like wildfire. True to his nature, James Crawford had shared the information with business contacts, who told friends, who told their families, and soon every parlor and drawing room in Natchez buzzed with the news. Within weeks, Everyone knew Thomas Whitmore had fathered children with an enslaved woman, sold those children to unsuspecting buyers, committed fraud, lied, and broken the unspoken rules that govern such matters. The reaction was swift and merciless. This was not about morality. Adams County did not care that Whitmore had exploited an enslaved woman over 18 years, or even that he had fathered children with her. What mattered was the deception, the public exposure, the fact that his secrets were now laid bare, threatening to expose the entire corrupt system. Other planters began to avoid him immediately. Men who once dined at his table and hunted on his land found excuses to be elsewhere. Invitations stopped coming. On Sundays, parishioners avoided him as if he were contagious. His wife Margaret sat stiff and pale in the pew, enduring stares and whispers, her face a mask of shame. Financial ruin followed swiftly. Creditors who had tolerated him for years suddenly demanded full payment. Banks called in loans. Business partners who had overlooked his gambling and mismanagement now refused any involvement. Within 3 months, Thomas Whitmore went from a struggling but respectable planter to a social and financial pariah. The buyers of his children acted on their threats. Jeremiah Stone filed suit in Alabama for a refund and damages for fraud. The Beaumonts did the same in Louisiana, and the sugar plantation joined, leaving Whitmore facing lawsuits in 3 states that could strip him bare. The cruelest blow came from within his household. Margaret, who had long pretended ignorance of her husband's affair and buried her shame to maintain appearances, was now confronted with public humiliation. Everyone knew, her friends and family, and her children away at school would eventually hear. She could not withstand it. In spring 1858, she showed signs of what contemporaries called nervous collapse. She stopped eating, sleeping, sat for hours staring, or exploded into rages, screaming and throwing objects. She became obsessed with the idea that everyone mocked her, that her life had been a lie. Her sister came from Virginia to help, but Margaret worsened. By summer, she could no longer speak clearly, muttering about children, blood and lies, sometimes laughing for no reason. In August, she was committed to the Mississippi State Lunatic Asylum in Jackson, never to recover her sanity or return home. The woman who had spent years preserving appearances was destroyed by truth. Thomas Whitmore was left alone. His wife was gone. His legitimate children, aware of the scandal, refused contact. Friends abandoned him. Creditors circled. Lawsuits pressed on. Celeste observed from the shadows, continuing her work in the house, cooking, cleaning, and serving, giving no hint of her role in his downfall. Few could imagine an enslaved woman orchestrating such a complex plan with intelligence, patience, and ruthless determination. But Celeste's work was not done. In fall 1858, Whitmore Hall was put up for sale to settle his debts. The plantation house equipment and enslaved people were to be auctioned. This was the moment Celeste had awaited, but also the most dangerous. If sold to a new owner, she could be taken far from Mississippi, far from hope of finding her children, separated from everything she had worked for over 3 years. She had one final card to play. James Crawford, who had spread the news about Whitmore, had become, if not an ally, at least a useful contact. He had profited from Whitmore's collapse, buying debts at a discount and positioning himself to acquire choice pieces of the estate. He was practical, and Celeste had proven herself an invaluable source. She approached Crawford once more a few weeks before the auction. Punctuation told him that she wanted to be free. She explained that she had more information, details about other planters in the county, secrets she had overheard during her years serving in the Whitmore house. She insisted she could be useful to him. She said she could keep collecting intelligence, keep giving him an advantage over his rivals. All she asked in return was her freedom. Crawford thought about the proposal. He was a businessman, and he recognized a valuable opportunity when he saw one. An enslaved woman who could read, who had proven she could gather and use sensitive information, who had connections across the domestic slave networks of Adams County, was worth far more free than enslaved. If he bought her and freed her, she would owe him. She would work willingly, out of gratitude and interest, rather than by force, giving him eyes and ears in places he could never go himself. He agreed. At the Whitmore estate auction in October 1858, James Crawford bought Celeste for $350. 1 week later, he signed the documents that legally freed her, making her a free woman for the first time in her life. She was about 36 years old and had spent over 20 years in slavery. Now, she could finally begin the work she had planned since the day her children were taken. Finding them would not be easy. The South in 1858 was vast and dangerous for a free black woman traveling alone. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 meant any black person could be seized and claimed as a runaway with almost no legal protection. Free papers could be stolen, destroyed, or ignored by white people who didn't want to acknowledge them. Traveling between states meant navigating confusing local laws and customs, any of which could lead to imprisonment or worse. And the people who held her children had no legal reason to sell them, no matter how much money Celeste could offer. But Celeste had advantages most people in her situation didn't. She could read and write. She had connections to James Crawford, and through him to merchants and traders across the South. She had spent 3 years learning about the slave trade, how it worked, the networks, markets, and paperwork that moved people from place to place, and she had a determination nothing could shake. She also had money, not a lot, but enough. Crawford had given her a small sum as part of their arrangement, enough to travel and support herself for a few months. She added to this by working as a domestic servant in Natchez, saving every penny she could, building a fund to buy her children's freedom. Her first goal was Samuel. He had been sold to Jeremiah Stone, a cotton planter in Marengo County, Alabama. Celeste knew from Crawford's contacts that Stone was one of the plaintiffs in the lawsuit against Whitmore, meaning he was angry, which meant he might be open to negotiation. She traveled to Alabama in the spring of 1859, carrying her free papers and letters of introduction from Crawford, and went to Stone's plantation. The meeting did not start well. Stone was suspicious of a free black woman traveling alone, asking questions about one of his slaves. He threatened to have her arrested. But Celeste stayed calm and persistent. She explained that Samuel was her son. She explained that she had money. She offered to buy him at a fair price, higher than what Stone had paid originally. She appealed to his self-interest, pointing out he was still involved in expensive litigation with Whitmore, and selling Samuel would remove a complication. Stone thought it over. He had never been comfortable with Samuel, not since learning the truth about the boy's parentage. Having a white man's son among his slaves was an awkward reminder he preferred to avoid, and Celeste was offering cash, more than the boy's market value. He agreed to sell. The price was $500 more than Celeste had. She returned to Mississippi and spent 6 months working, saving, and borrowing small amounts from Crawford and supportive free black communities in Natchez. By fall 1859, she had enough. She returned to Alabama, paid Stone, and left the plantation with her son. Samuel was 15 years old. He barely recognized her. He had spent 4 years as a field hand, working from dawn to dusk, beaten when he slowed, and often half-starved. The boy who had resisted his captors was now a young man with scars on his back and a wariness in his eyes that broke Celeste's heart. But he was alive. He was free, and he was with her. They traveled back to Mississippi together, and Celeste immediately started planning the next rescue. Eliza was in New Orleans, still owned by the Beaumont family. This would be trickier. New Orleans was a large city with a complex slave market, and the Beaumonts were wealthy and might not want to sell. But Celeste had learned from her first success. Patience and persistence could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. She went to New Orleans in early 1860 and spent weeks studying the Beaumont household. She learned their routines, finances, and social connections. She found that Eliza had become a skilled seamstress, which increased her value, but that the family was planning to move to France to escape growing tensions over slavery. They would not take their slaves with them and would likely sell. Celeste posed as a buyer. Using Crawford's connections, she presented herself as a representative of a free black community in Ohio seeking to buy enslaved people and bring them north. The story was believable enough to avoid too many questions. The Beaumonts agreed to sell Eliza for $600, more than Celeste had ever seen in one place. But she had prepared. She had saved, borrowed, and ensured the money was ready. In March 1860, Celeste purchased her daughter's freedom. Eliza was 13, thin and quiet, with eyes too old for her face. She had spent nearly 5 years in the Beaumont household, learning to sew, clean, and be invisible just as her mother had before. When Celeste found her and revealed who she was, Eliza didn't cry. She didn't speak. She stared for a long moment and then nodded as if she had always known this day would come. Now Celeste had 2 children, but Isaiah was still missing. Finding Isaiah was the hardest task. He had been sold to a sugar plantation in Louisiana, but Celeste could not determine which one. Sugar country was harsher than cotton plantations, more brutal and deadly. Enslaved people there worked in grinding mills and boiling houses, and children sold young often didn't survive. Celeste spent over 2 years searching for her youngest son, traveling across Louisiana chasing rumors and leads that often proved false. She bribed overseers and clerks for plantation records. She questioned enslaved people who might have seen a boy like Isaiah. She faced constant danger from suspicious white people, from slave catchers seeking profit, and from the risks of travel in a region on the brink of war. The war itself made everything harder. When Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter in April 1861, the South descended into chaos. Travel became risky and unpredictable. The networks Celeste relied on for information were disrupted. Many who had helped her were now focused on survival, not her search. But Celeste didn't give up. She had not come this far, destroyed a powerful man, freed herself, and rescued 2 children only to abandon the third. Isaiah was out there, and she would find him or die trying. She found him in spring 1863 on a plantation called Belter, about 50 miles west of New Orleans. He was 12. He had survived 8 years in the sugar fields, which was remarkable. But survival had come at a cost. Isaiah was small, malnourished, and scarred. He limped from an old injury. When Celeste finally revealed herself, he did not know her. He had been 5 when taken, with no memory of her face, voice, or the songs she once sang. To Isaiah, Celeste was a stranger claiming to be family. He was cautious, frightened, and angry. But Celeste was patient. Years of patience had trained her. She could wait a little longer. Purchasing Isaiah's freedom was different from the others because of the war. Belter was in Union, occupied territory by spring 1863, and the Emancipation Proclamation had theoretically freed all enslaved people in Confederate states. But reality on the ground was more complicated. Many enslaved people were still kept in bondage by masters who refused. Many others had escaped to Union lines and were living in contraband camps, free in name, but struggling to survive. The legal status of people like Isaiah was uncertain, and the plantation owners did everything they could to hold onto control over their workers. Celeste did not attempt to buy Isaiah. Instead, she approached the Union officers overseeing the area and told them her story. She showed them her freedom papers and the papers for Samuel and Eliza. She spoke of Thomas Whitmore and all that he had done, about the sale of his own children, about the cruelty and fraud that had defined his life, and she asked them to help her bring her son home. The officers were moved by her account. Perhaps they recognized the power of a story that exposed the horrors of slavery so clearly. Perhaps they were simply decent men who wanted to do what was right. Whatever their reason, they sent soldiers to Belter and brought Isaiah back. Celeste held her youngest son for the first time in 8 years. He was stiff in her arms, unsure, still unable to believe this was real, but she held him anyway and whispered that everything would be all right now. She told him she had been searching for him for so long. She promised she would never let him go again. It took months for Isaiah to trust her. It took years for him to begin to heal from the harm done to him. But Celeste was patient. She had always been patient. Slowly and carefully, she rebuilt the family that Thomas Whitmore had tried to destroy. As for Whitmore, his story ended exactly as Celeste had planned. After the sale of his plantation and all his possessions, he was left with nothing. Lawsuits drained whatever assets remained. His creditors took all they could. He moved into a boarding house in Natchez, living in a single room, drowning himself in alcohol day after day. The man who once dreamed of being one of the greatest planters of Mississippi was now a penniless drunk, unable to walk down the street without people staring and whispering. The war finished what Celeste had started when Union forces occupied Natchez in 1863. Whitmore lost even the small income he had from Confederate bond investments. He was briefly arrested as a Confederate sympathizer, though he had never truly supported the Southern cause with anything beyond words. After his release, he returned to his boarding house and continued drinking. Thomas Whitmore died in 1864, alone in his rented room, from liver failure caused by years of alcoholism. He was 52. No one attended his funeral except the minister, paid to say a few words over his grave. His surviving sons did not come. His wife, Margaret, was still alive in an asylum in Jackson, unaware of her husband's death. Newspapers did not report his passing. The man who had sold his own children for $1,000 died forgotten and unmourned. exactly as he deserved. Celeste outlived him by nearly 30 years. After the war, she settled in Ohio with her 3 children. Samuel became a carpenter, building homes for the growing black community in Cincinnati. Eliza became a seamstress, eventually opening her own dress shop that served both black and white customers. Isaiah, despite his difficult start, learned to read and write and became a teacher, dedicating his life to educating black children who had been denied knowledge that could set them free. Celeste never remarried. She never fully trusted another man after what Thomas Whitmore had done, but she was not alone. She was surrounded by her children, and later by grandchildren who called her Mama Celeste. Listening to her stories about the old days, about slavery, and about how she had survived and saved the people she loved. She spoke of patience. She spoke of the power of knowledge, about how learning to read gave her tools no one could take away. She taught them the importance of remembering, of never forgetting what had been done to their people, so it could never happen again. She did not often speak of revenge, but sometimes late at night, when the grandchildren were asleep and only her adult children were with her, she would smile quietly and say that justice comes in many forms. Some justice comes from courts and laws. Some comes from God, and some comes from those who refuse to accept powerlessness, who watch and wait, plan carefully, and then bring down their enemies with truth, patience, and unbreakable will. Celeste died in 1891 at about 69 years old. She was buried in a Cincinnati cemetery, surrounded by her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. Her grave marker, paid for by her descendants, bore a simple inscription she had chosen herself. She found her children. By her death, Celeste had over 20 living descendants. Every one of them was free. Everyone knew the story of their ancestor who had been enslaved, violated, and watched her children sold away. And everyone knew how she had responded, not with violence or despair, but with intelligence, patience, and a love so strong that cruelty could not defeat it. Thomas Whitmore had thought he could do anything to Celeste because the law said she had no rights, because Southern society protected men like him and crushed women like her. He was wrong. The system built on lies, cruelty, and denial of human dignity was always weaker than it seemed. Celeste understood something Whitmore never did. Power is not always obvious. It does not always come from wealth, weapons, or laws. Sometimes power comes from knowing what your enemy hides. Sometimes it comes from patience, from waiting years for the right moment. Sometimes it comes from love, from a mother's desperate determination to save her children. The enslaved woman Whitmore thought he owned became the architect of his ruin. The children he sold grew up free in a nation that abolished slavery. The family he tried to scatter reunited and built a legacy that lasted generations. Some debts are not paid with money. Some debts are paid with ruin. And some chains, the chains of determination, love, and righteous anger are unbreakable.